Welcome to this meeting, this recording rather. The Institute of Economic Affairs has been undertaking a review of the Adam Smith's book, of the Wealth of Nations. In the previous sessions, we've undertaken two books. The first was on the book one of the Adam Smith books was of the causes of improvement in the productive powers of labor, which had chapters 1 through to 11, to 12 rather. And then the second book that we covered in this series was of the nature, accumulation, and employment of stock, which had five chapters. So today we'll be covering the third book, Adam Smith's third book of the Wealth of Nations. And the title for this particular book is Of the Different Progress of Opulence in Different Nations. And to help us understand what the contents and what Adam Smith was writing to us about, I have four of my colleagues who will actually look, each of them will go through each of the chapters. There are four chapters. So we'll have the first chapter being which my colleague Fiona will take us through, and the title of that chapter is Of the Natural Progress of Opulence, and we'll seek to hear from Fiona what the contents of that chapter are. That will be followed by my colleague Emmanuel, who will look at chapter 2 of that particular book, and the title of this is Of the Discouragement of Agriculture in the Ancient State of Europe. That will be followed by the third chapter, again will be covered by colleague Winnie, and that's on the rise and progress of cities and towns. Then we'll conclude with the fourth chapter by my colleague Moses, who will take us through the chapter titled How the Commerce of the Towns Contributed to the Improvement of the Country. So to kick us, to get this going, I want to invite my colleague Fiona rather, and to pose the question as she's coming on, to help us understand what arguments, Fiona, do you think Adam Smith is making in that particular chapter? Kindly take us through. Welcome.
I will go straight into the arguments that Smith makes in book 3, chapter 1, which is of the natural progress of opulence. Now, in this specific chapter, we can see that Adam Smith is advancing a particular proposition that I feel remains deeply relevant even to the economic structures of a lot of countries today. And that is that when you look at towns, cities, and then the countryside, which is the rural areas, they do not prosper at one another's expense. Rather, they are bound by some sort of system of exchange. So when you look at the countryside, think about they're the ones that actually supply the raw materials. So it could be grain, it could be specific minerals, it could be livestock, vegetables, etc. Right? And then now the towns or the cities then take this produce and then they process it or they use it to be manufactured goods. So each of the different parties actually end up benefiting from one another as opposed to one being left off worse off than the other. So maybe I can give two examples. One is when we look at even Kenya today, and we look at agriculture and the role that it plays in our economy in terms of employment, in terms of contributing to GDP. The other day, we had the economic survey of 2026 out, and it shows that agriculture actually contributes 23.2% to the national GDP directly. And then when it comes to employment, it does a huge chunk of the people who live in the rural areas, sorry, in the rural areas actually are employed in agriculture. So in a sense, you can see that the countryside does remain indispensable to the functioning of even the urban economic life, because the food that is grown even in the rural areas is actually consumed in the urban areas. And just to again explain this relationship between the countryside and the urban area, I'm sure like a lot of us are aware of the recent disruptions even in global fertilizer, where now you see indeed like in the Kenyan market, our farmers are, for them to be able to produce whether they come from Trans Nzoia or Nakuru, the different counties anyway, whether it's wheat, whether it's maize, they do depend on imported inputs. But now that fertilizer, that a big chunk of it we actually import, there has been supply chain disruptions. And so of course this then raises the input cost to our farmers. So we can see that when one part of the chain is disrupted, then another is affected. Even case in point, when again we think about it globally, you remember in 2021 when we had the Suez Canal, there was an Ever Given ship, right, that blocked the Suez Canal, and that is an area where I think about 12 or so percent of global trade was temporarily really affected then. So you found that factories that were relying on inputs, there were delays. You have retailers in Asia that were facing specific shipping bottlenecks. And so these two, the town and the city and the rural areas, you can see that they actually depend on one another. So one brings the raw materials and then the other is able to process it. So again, then Smith goes ahead and he makes an argument on that the land close to towns become more valuable because of lower transport costs. Again, you can see this even in the Kenyan element. So I'll give an example of a fruit that I really like. That's avocado. And so it's grown in Siaya County. Kwanza, first of all, they have the really nice ones, the oily ones. So you have it in Siaya County and you have it in Murang'a, that's really next to Nairobi. So Murang'a is next, so the transport cost will be much lower, but yet that same avocado is sold at the same price in Nairobi County, which is an urban county, as opposed to Siaya and Murang'a. So there is actually an advantage, or there's an incentive for me to have, if I was to choose, for me to have land next to the urban area than far away from it, because then it's cheaper for me. I'm able to access the markets faster. You know, there's reduction in terms of spoilage. Can you imagine transporting avocados all the way from Siaya in comparison to transporting it from Murang'a. So I could get here with, you know, a big chunk of my produce having spoiled as compared to the farmer who's bringing it from Murang'a. So then Smith goes ahead and he proposes another another argument, which is that rural surplus is what sustains urban life. So of course he does say, rightly so, that, you know, cities generally don't feed themselves. They depend on agricultural output from surrounding regions and now increasingly distant markets. So again, to bring it a bit home, you can see that a substantial share of food consumed in urban Kenya is not produced within that immediate area. So even if you look at Nairobi, very, very, very few areas. And if it's there, it's just a very small land in which they produce food. So you can see that for us in Kenya, we import a lot from maize, we import a lot from sugar, from rice, like we import a lot of rice, a lot of cooking oil, and all of that. And I think even we get a lot of our food from Uganda. And it's very easy for a consumer in the urban areas to say consume maize from Uganda, consume onions from Tanzania, consume potatoes from Nyandarua all in 1 week. So that we're getting a lot of our raw materials from different areas. Now, but for this particular point, he argues that, you know, after the specific rural areas have been able to provide enough for themselves, then that's when they're able to sell the extra sugar or the extra maize or um, the extra milk or whatever. So they don't sell what they don't sell what they need. It's from the extra that they're able to sell. So then that means that, you know, towns are able to prosper from this surplus. So if there was no surplus, then the towns and the cities would not be able to prosper. So then in his so to conclude that point, you see that he's trying to say that opulence actually comes because of surpluses. Then Smith goes ahead and he again argues that, you know, if people were left to themselves, they would often prefer to first invest in land and agriculture before they turn into commerce. So his argument is that when you look at land, it feels safer, it's more tangible, and then it's also less dependent on uncertain distant markets. So in many respects, this remains visible in Kenya. So you look at agriculture again, which is the largest sector of the economy, but then there's a shift in terms of the modern pattern of investment. So for instance, very many young investors these days, I see that they're increasingly viewing tech, urban biashara, they're looking at, you know, property development, which is like your real estate, as more attractive than actually direct agricultural production. So, but yet his instinct when it comes to land as security, it still persists because even still, you can see that across Kenya, land remains also one of the most, how can I say it, most preferred stores of wealth. So you now, very many people, because the areas that before people would want to buy land have become very expensive. So people are now moving into Kajiado County, inland completely, Machakos County, where we can still witness sustained land demand. And it's not only being they're not going for it because they want to plant or they want to you know, to do all of these things. It's not only for productive use, but they seem to think, okay, land will always appreciate and it will be always more stable. And so therefore it could be I can sell it later. So even if I buy it for like 500,000 per acre, I can come later and sell it for like 2,000. So there's still that. It's not so much, but it's still there. And then, so when I was reading the chapter, one of the questions that I was trying to answer is, if I look at Kenyan policies that the government is fronting, does it seem to reflect some of the ideas that Smith is raising in this chapter? And yes.
Dana, that will
Sorry?
come in the second part.
No. I'll just still continue.
Okay.
Yes. So I was trying to answer whether like the Kenyan government is trying to, in terms of policies, whether they can actually reflect this argument. And I can see it even in terms of the enduring political and economic centrality of agriculture. So you can see more and more that that there are programs around fertilizer subsidy. They are constantly, they seed support schemes. We have a farmer in our in our house, and the other day she was being told to go and take seeds. You can see there's constant conversations around irrigation investment, and even when you look at senior public officials when they are speaking, often you find that they are citing, maize output, milk production has increased from like this number of liters to this number of liters in 1 year. Uh, they mostly use like, fertilizer distribution even as markers of economic performance. So it ties in with what Smith is saying. So it's not accidental. You can see that it reflects an implicit recognition that, rural productivity remains foundational to broader national economic stability. So back to another point that Smith raises in the chapter is that farmers cannot function in isolation. So here he says that, agricultural life depends on the services of carpenters, metalworks, transporters. So all of these people, they provide services to one another. So they come together. They're not permanently dispersed, because then it becomes really hard. And I think we've seen it even in the previous chapters where it's hard to specialize in terms of labor when the market is very dispersed. And so people then prefer to come together and to cluster so that they can then be able to focus on a particular trade. So I think we can see this even in Kenya when markets such as Karatina, Moya, and I think it was Maua, when they emerged and actually expanded largely because of they were surrounding these agricultural communities. And people were in need of those contracted services. So whether it's transport, whether it's storage, whether it's exchange ports. And then, so now this led to towns actually becoming a commercial node that is linking rural production to wider markets. And then finally, Smith suggests that there seems to exist like a natural sequence of economic development. So he goes from agriculture first, and then manufacturing second, and then foreign trade third. And so for this, you can see that he argues, when land becomes expensive, right? So first of all, let me back that up. So first of all, you find that people would prefer to farm because land is affordable and it's available and it's easier, right? And so people prefer to farm. But then when you find situations in which land becomes expensive, such as Nairobi, then people now tend to go into other things like business or real estate development and all of that. And I think you can see this even in Kenya, for instance. So in Nairobi, I, I would be surprised if there are any people who are buying land to actually plant vegetables or to plant like a forest of avocados. Again, it's very rare, but people would actually take the land, build malls, build apartments. So that way, because maybe they feel that the value that they are getting from not taking part in agriculture is much, much higher for them than that. So, but then he tends to focus on if land was affordable, then definitely people would have gone into agriculture and then later would have gone into manufacturing and then now trade, which now would be then trade with other countries. Um, and so I think, that's mostly what he argues for. So I think the other parts and how it's related to to Kenya, then I will add in the next section. Thank you, Steve.
Awesome, Fiona. Awesome, Fiona. Thanks a lot.
This chapter is it's about what happened, what created the conditions under which um, agriculture in particular, but then Europe in general, was driven into serfdom. So the chapter begins by Adam Smith talking about what exactly happened in the at the big picture level, which was that the Western Roman Empire fell, and as it fell, what this meant functionally was since the empire wasn't there to defend its land holdings, then you had what were, in the eyes of the Romans, the barbarians, the German and Scythian tribes that came and overran the Western Roman Empire. So when these warlords came in, they took uh, lots of land as their own property. And the violence that under which this land into which this land descended meant that there was less trade between the towns and the countrysides. Um, Towns were emptied, land went uncultivated, and then now Western Europe, which was wealthier under the Roman Empire, fell into poverty. So what he's arguing is that during the Roman Empire, the land was who it was held by citizens of the empire itself. But then these warlords who came in, they they subjugated those who sat on the land into, you know, into people that they protected, that they could use as soldiers for who over whom they exercised power. You know, they were the executive, the judiciary for these people. And for them, the more land was consolidated, the more power they had. And so they we we first observe, and what Adam Smith then shows us is that when it came to succession of ownership, it was preferred that the land remain contiguous, right? And he uses the word engrossed, that it remain together, because this was the measure by which um, these petty princes sort of measured their success. So power was just derived from the extent of landholding. And although he didn't mention it explicitly, my interpretation was that this is because of the population sitting on the land, in addition to the size of the land. It's really about how many people do you have on it, because these are people who you could levy taxes on, and you could raise into war bands to go into war against other chieftains. Because, you know, if you really think about it, uh, it the especially given the argument that follows, which is that um, Adam Smith is trying to explain why these pieces of land went undeveloped. If power came from how much food you produced and how much you could trade it, then the ownership of land wouldn't be the issue. You would just tax the people who are developing the land. But then he's trying to understand why this land, these chieftains would hold such large parcels of land, but then not develop them. And as I gather, the reason that this land went undeveloped is they weren't interested in that. Why weren't the landlords and the serfs who lived under them uninterested in developing the land? Well, economists who could talk about incentives, which is what he mentioned. He says the serf himself doesn't have an incentive to do any real hard work on the land and develop it, because the landlord could take any value at any time. right, on the one hand. On the other hand, the landlord himself doesn't want to develop the land because they they are more focused on just having large pieces of land. And I think that it's because of the number of people, in addition to how much land you have. Because if we're talking about a period where there's no real advantage that a piece of land offers you against another warlord, unless you as warlords have come together in some form of a parliament, and the weight of your weight upon the collective decision is determined by the size of land. So Adam Smith then went on to say that if this concentration of land was temporary, it would have been, maybe tolerable. He is speaking from a perspective of economic growth. If you could inherit the land or it could be sold off, then this concentration of land would be temporary and there would be a break where the ownership would change. But then there was no such break. Instead, the landlord would organize to give the land by some now think that at that time these landlords have to pick an attribute about someone that's undeniable. So it can't be something like they have good character or they're moral or they're good managers of the land. To them, these attributes are too subjective. It has to be something that's clear and cannot be taken away. So what is that? That the attributes of gender and the attributes of birth order. So a landlord gives the land to the firstborn to continue to hold it, and that firstborn will hold it in until they die, and then they'll give it away again to the next one. So the concentration doesn't remain, that is not temporary, it becomes permanent, this concentration of land. So if land was just about subsistence, then you would divide the land and give it to equally to the children so they can plant their crops and live off of it. And this is what the Romans actually did. But if land is about power and protection, it's better to keep that they keep it undivided. So that's the law of this law of primogeniture, the practices of primogeniture, which is that the firstborn gets all the land. Again, defense, the idea of defense doesn't make sense unless it's about all of you people being under the landlord or under his protection because you are on the land that he owns. Now, if one of the issues for Adam Smith and for him as a moral philosopher is that by giving the land to only one of the children, you've actually impoverished the rest. And he observes that because he's writing this in the 17th century, that these laws of primogeniture endured beyond their original purpose. If in Roman times you were protected by the empire by virtue of being a citizen, then you divided up the land because the land, if you were not developing it or doing anything with it and someone came with an offer to purchase, you didn't mind giving it up. But if the empire crumbles and foreign warlords come and they take pieces of land and they are interested in aggrandizing their power, the landlord is not interested in efficiency, efficient production of crops. He's interested in power. So he doesn't develop the land at all. Then, then the land just remains undivided. So which brings us to a legal restriction called the entail. So the entail prevented estates from being divided. We're moving between the period, like let's say it's around the years um, 800, 900, just around 1000 AD and the 17th century. And he thinks that, so he's saying that the entail, the law that prevents a landed estate from being divided, is still existing so many hundreds of years later and hundreds of years after the original purpose. You already have the United Kingdom. It's providing the rule of law over there's a government providing the rule of law. You're Adam Smith, you're not necessarily relying on a warlord, a local warlord, but it's the king who's providing the your protection. So you as a serf or you as a smaller person don't need defense from your lord. So Adam Smith says, now in this case, these entails don't make sense. Where the law is saying you can't divide the land, it has to be sold um, as one, or it can't be divided, it can't be sold, it can't be given away, but has to remain in a line of heirs. Then this law now is creating the conditions under which poverty continues, because now those who live on the land, they their protection doesn't necessarily come from the landlord, but yet they can't even own this piece of land. The so he gives us now other examples from in his time, but from around the region. And for example, you have this occupation in France called the métayer, and a métayer is basically a farmer. This farmer is given rights by the landlord to farm, but yet there's still not a huge improvement in productivity. And Adam Smith explains that this because in this case the métayer actually can have his land confiscated from him by the landlord at any time. The landlord can rewrite their contract at will. This means that if the landlord observed that the farmer was suddenly making a lot of money, then he would, and he had presided over very attractive improvements in capital, then the landlord would simply swoop in and would be tempted and would most probably and did come in and take whatever it is that the métayer had developed. So the métayer knows that unless he's doing things in secret or engaging in a different kind of a trade, any visible improvements in wealth coming from the land owned by the landowner will be taken away. And so on top of that, the métayer had to pay a 50% tax. But then, there's some economies in the world today where tax rates can be just as high, but yet people are rich. Why? Because of private property laws that allow property to be transacted against and to be divided up, however the allocator desires. So the point there is that entails might have been necessary for defense and security, but they were no longer necessary by the time Adam Smith is writing. Now, the next point is that if, let's think about this carefully. If we come to the modern day, and just look at the major ways that land laws are structured, comparing between countries. Take the United States. In the United States, if you discover some resources, some raw materials on your land, it is actually yours to exploit. You have the right to get wealthy off of oil that was discovered in your backyard. So it was not uncommon in the turn of the 20th century to have Americans owning a few of these oil rigs, pumping, or is it oil rig? It's I forget the name of the machine, but you know it, that pumps oil out of the ground. But in Kenya, anything below the land is a property of the government. One reason government jobs or being in the government or capturing the state is attractive is that by virtue of capturing the state, you can actually gain ownership over the minerals of the land. This example just shows us how land laws and in particular incentives in general can skew the outcomes and can actually inform and actually do inform the behavior of of citizens. If so great proprietors, big landowners were also not interested in um, improving the land. Whenever they had some surge in wealth from whatever activity, whether it was warring or what they would do with any extra money was to expand the size of the land. They weren't interested in making small improvements. And so Adam Smith says that these landowners didn't have entrepreneurial instincts. They didn't have the discipline to because improving the land means you have to pay attention to small savings, pay attention to small gains. You have to build that skill. If you're not incentivized by um, opportunities to trade, for example, then you're not as interested in improving the land. There's something else that he observed, which was that landlords would spend a lot of money making pretty houses, buying pretty furniture, buying pretty clothes. And many times they went bankrupt doing this. They pursued status, not productivity leading to wealth. Um, Personally, I could not really understand why these landlords wouldn't want to. Um, I mean, I could see that if the people under them are almost like their property, they almost have. They're barely legal entities unto themselves. They can't transact with the serfs. The serfs just we can see why they make just enough to feed themselves. But as I was reading, I remained not fully convinced. I could see that they want power, but the fact that they also spend money on ornaments, what he calls ornaments, which is just fancy things that are not productive, remained mysterious to me. When it comes to slaves, he made the argument that slavery was inefficient and unprofitable. But I also had a bit of a counter to this, because when it came to the market for sugar, slavery was very, very profitable because you could extract very, very high profits if you didn't have to pay the people who worked on it. You just forced them to work. And, he says that people who are forced to work don't have an incentive to work. But yet, slavery in the West Indies and the United States, starting giving especially the example of sugar, they had enjoyed such high margins. On the demand side, people were addicted to sugar. On the supply side, the slaves got nothing, no pay for this very difficult work. It seems to me that although slavery is abhorrent, I'm not convinced that it was not profitable. So I'll end my exploration of this chapter there and say that fundamentally, he had a point to explain that the laws governing, in his case, the engrossment, the accumulation, and the dispersal, the allocation, the ownership and the allocation of land have a strong bearing on the wealth that those who live on that land will actually be incentivized to produce and then later enjoy. And that in Kenya, the way that land has been accumulated, and then the way that that the land laws are structured, giving that example, especially of ownership of natural resources, ex helps to explain the outcomes that we enjoy or
Right.
endure. Thanks.
See the build-up within the two chapters of the book, from Fiona's presentation and now to Manuel's presentation. I've taken down my notes. We'll share in due course and have some back and forth thereafter. But moving on swiftly to our third chapter of the book, I want to invite my colleague Winnie. And Winnie's chapter is titled Of the Rise and Progress of Cities and Towns. So Winnie, please let us know, in your chapter, what you're going through, what arguments do you see Adam Smith making? Please take it away.
Thanks, Jairo. Thank you, guys. So as Jairo has mentioned, my name is Winnie, and I work at the Institute of Economic Affairs under the Futures and Foresights program. So my chapter for book 3 is chapter 3 of the rise and progress of cities and towns. And if you read through this chapter, you realize that Smith is trying to answer, my interpretation is that Smith is trying to answer two important questions. And the first question that Smith is trying to answer is how Europe moved from the collapse, from a collapse and now so there's a collapse, and which is stagnating growth, and there's a conversation of poverty. If you listen to Fiona and Emmanuel, you can clearly tell that there's a lot of poverty going on there. So what he's trying to dissect in this chapter is how then they moved from that level of poverty and stagnation to number 2, having economies that have grown over a period of a century. So in my mind, that is what my interpretation was. And if you continue to read, he answers these two questions by just pointing us to the fact that for him, what liberated or what made this, gave way for growth during that time was the growth of cities and towns. For him, the growth of cities and towns changed so many things. So for us to be able to understand Smith and his arguments, we have to take ourselves back to when he was writing. And remember, Smith is writing 250 years ago. And so we have to immerse ourselves into that world that he is describing. And the world he is describing is a world that is deeply fragmented. So there is a fall of the Roman Empire, and with the fall of the Roman Empire, Europe becomes deeply fragmented. And so with that fragmentation comes uh, political powers breaking apart, trade networks collapsed, and most people retreated to a rural life, which seemed to be more quiet. And with that retreat to a rural life, societies became what he calls feudal. And to just explain to us, when you're speaking of a feudal society, you're speaking of a society where power and wealth are really, really based entirely on land ownership. And the society is organized through relationships of dependence, and there's a lot of loyalty rather than markets, rather than relationships through markets and free exchange. So people are really, really restricted largely under a feudal society. And so again, if you look at feudal societies, you notice that when you're speaking wealth in that society, you're speaking wealth relating to land ownership. And when you're speaking land ownership, the first thing that you'll notice that Smith is speaking about is powerful landlords who controlled huge estates. And these estates were largely worked by those who seemed poor, and he refers to them as peasants. We still do. So if you go back to what Fiona was explaining and a bit of what Emmanuel has explained, there's a bit of that feudalism that Adam Smith speaks about. Adam Smith speaks about. So so if again you look at the society that Smith was observing, you notice that most people only lived to survive. So you're not thinking about anything else. You're just thinking about how you're going to survive for that moment. So you notice that farmers now produce just enough food to feed themselves and pay whatever obligations to their landlords. And they did not think beyond that. And so because of that, which in my view is considered a limitation to growth, there was almost no economic dynamism. So one, there was no innovation. So if at all there was, it was very slow. And then the trade ties or the trading that was happening was very weak. And then the markets are very limited, because if you're already just thinking of surviving, you can't think of what you're going to trade or how the market would look. So what Smith is arguing is that the feudal society really trapped Europe into an economic stagnation of some sort, because that system only gave very little incentive. It gave very little incentive to improve, for members of that society to improve their productivity. So then again, he points out, as you continue to read, Smith points out that the peasants in feudal society or in feudal Europe often lived under conditions where landlords really seized surplus production. And I think Fiona mentioned, or if they're not seizing your surplus, they are making demands that are absurd, for lack of a better word. So the system in that feudal society, what it did was it punished productivity instead of rewarding it. So with that happening, what Smith observes then is that towns begin to emerge. And when the towns began to emerge, in his view, that was the beginning of a turning point. So at first, he looks at towns as not really glamorous places, not like today we look at a town and you think glamour. For him, he wasn't looking at it as glam. He observed that so many urban residents were still poor and lacked a bit of rights. So he gave examples. And he gives examples. I have to go to his examples. So he gives examples of medieval charters. And these medieval charters showed that those in town had to be granted basic freedoms. And the basic freedoms were as basic as the right to marry without a lot of permission. So for you to even get married, you needed permission from the Lord. And then also the issue of your children inheriting
Winnie, please move your
property.
please move your right up. I think you're covering the mic. Okay, go ahead.
You can hear me?
Yes, now better.
Yeah, so even with the being granted those basic rights went as far as people having to ask for rights to even get married, inherit property. And in that property inheritance conversation, there is a question of leaving behind a will. Because if you're going to leave, if people are going to inherit your property, that can only be done if you're leaving behind a will to explain how that inheritance process should take place. So let's think about what that means. So what this essentially means is if those rights had to be officially granted, it just shows you how limited people's freedoms were before. So if you were to go back and live in 250 years back, that is how limited your freedoms would be. But now the town people, in as much as the people started moving to town, they were not immediately wealthy capitalists or anything. They had to begin from a position of dependence too. But with that, with having that position of dependence, it wasn't a permanent position because with time, things started changing. The changes started happening. And why did this change start happening? The change started happening because kings started supporting the towns. And the kings who are supporting the towns were not supporting the towns really because, not necessarily because they cared about economic development, but to them, they were looking at the political usefulness of these towns. So if you look at the feudal lords and how powerful they were, okay, they were really rivals to the monarchs and the kings. So the kings really needed allies. And which other way to get these allies other than supporting those who are moving into these towns? So and moving into towns allow people to be in a position to now provide taxes, soldiers, commercial revenues. So beyond the economic benefits that came with it, the monarch started granting these towns privileges and protections. Okay, so and just to give us an example, Smith refers to, he gives us an example of in England, where King John granted freedoms to the towns. So in France, you notice that Louis the Fat established two councils and urban militias to weaken the feudal nobles. So in Germany, another example he gives is that in Germany, so many emerging many towns emerged and they were very independent, and they eventually formed what he's calling the Hanseatic League. I hope I got that pronunciation right. And the Hanseatic League was one of the most powerful commercial alliances that existed in the medieval Europe. So according to Smith, he believed that those privileges really changed the economic environment completely. Because one, towns were allowed to govern themselves. They were allowed to collect taxes in a more predictable way. And then the trade environment was also regulated, but it wasn't regulated by external people. It was regulated more internally. And then came the building of the walls. So the Rome wall was then built. And why was the Rome built? The Rome wall was built for protection. So instead of living entirely at the mercy of the landlords, what happened is that merchants and craftsmen at that time could now have some level of security. And we don't need to even go into why that security was important, because it is one of those arguments that, again, Smith makes, because once people believe they can keep their profits from the profits they make from their labor, they begin to think differently. Because now with that security, you're not worried about anybody coming in to take away from your surplus or to take away from whatever profit you're making. You feel more safe. So the moment you're feeling more safe, what happens is you start working harder. And in working harder, you start saving. And when you start saving, you start investing. When you start investing, you take risks, and finally, you become very, very innovative. So those are some of the things that the emergence of cities and towns granted and allowed to happen. Then just to give us how important that security component was, Smith gives an example of peasants who would be fleeing into the towns. So the moment they accumulated a small amount of wealth, they moved from the rural into these cities and towns. And they did that because for them at that point, towns were safer places for their wealth. You're not going to convince them otherwise. So, because in many places, if a peasant escaped to a town and remained there for a certain period, what then happened is if you stay there for a period of a year or so, you become what they are calling legally free. So that freedom for them is something they were really, really looking forward to because of the benefits that were coming with them. So in a nutshell, what then happened in people who were very ambitious and productive then found refuge in the cities. So wealth, labor, skills slowly became concentrated where? They slowly became concentrated in towns and cities, because that's where now everybody was moving to for safety. What does that movement then mean? It means that there is more trade. So this is where Smith observes that trade began to matter. So unlike in the isolated rural estates, the emergence of towns and cities allowed for people to connect through their markets. So with that, goods could now be bought and sold beyond immediate local consumption. Because remember, initially, people were just thinking of surviving. But now, because of the safety and everything that was coming with the towns and cities, those who were there were actually now thinking beyond survival. They were thinking ahead in terms of what other benefit beyond survival can they get. So he speaks of craftsmen who now would specialize in producing shoes, tools, cloth, or furniture. So merchants moved goods between regions, okay? And because of the movement of goods between regions, the economic life of those people became less about survival and more of exchange, like I have explained before. So he introduces a new concept, and that is specialization. And in introducing the concept of specialization, he emphasizes on why it is important. And Smith explains that when people focus on a specific task, it simply means that productivity will rise. For example, he gives example of a cloth maker. So when a cloth maker becomes better at producing a particular cloth than someone trying to do anything alone, okay? So that the market for that cloth allows for that specialization, not because nobody else can produce it, but because there's a specific person who can produce that. So because goods were being exchanged between markets, that exchange of goods between markets allowed for specialization, because producers can now trade for what they do not make themselves. So for example, if Winnie is producing a dress and Fiona is producing shoes, Fiona and I can trade so that she is getting the dress from me and I am getting shoes from her. So when this happened, when all these concepts merged together, what happened is the commerce across Europe was revived. So Smith gives examples, and the examples he gives is the example of Italian cities. And the Italian cities he gives examples of Venice, Genoa, and Pisa. I hope I'm pronouncing those names right. If not, Forgive me. So if you look at these cities, they became wealthy through trade. And this trade was largely during Crusades. And the Crusades is when people would move, like you'd have a road trip, what we call road trips nowadays, into another town. Yeah. So with those Crusades, what happened is even armies, supplied provisions were provided, were transported, and this transport happened between Europe all the way to the Mediterranean markets. So that movement again connected Europe to the Mediterranean markets. So in as much as he observed that Europe remained poor and agricultural, they were more into agribusiness, their trading cities accumulated enormous wealth because of what they were transporting to those other cities. So if you look at this point, in my view, I think Smith made a very, very important point that as those cities were growing, the trade allowed for them to grow wealthy, even though they were surrounded by countrysides that were poor, because you have people who are coming in with more goods that you can trade. And next, it was allowing them to connect with larger markets that they could not have been able to connect to if they did not if they were limited to local demand alone. Yeah. So what he's doing, is just a description of how cities emerged and the benefits that came with this emergence. Then the one thing that he also brings on board is the manufacturing component. So he describes how England, for example, exported raw wool from places. I have to read the names first. England exported wool to places like Flanders and imported fine cloth and wine from more advanced commercial regions. So over time, merchants realized that instead of importing manufactured goods, they could actually produce them locally. What did that mean? That now manufacturing began to spread. So he explains that some industries emerged by copying the foreign industries. So we are looking at what is Kisumu doing, for example, that we can benefit from Nairobi. And so instead of always going to Kisumu to get that product, we begin to ask ourselves, how can we set up the same manufacturing structure or manufacturing plant so that instead of getting from Kisumu, we do it for ourselves, okay? And he gives example of silk, which was by that time being manufactured, but now because of that, the thought I have explained, it spread. So instead of it just being limited to Lucca, he now explains how it spread from Lucca to Venice. And this was not without a political conflict, of course. People always look at their interests. So those from Venice are wondering, okay, so why is Lucca doing this to us? But Lucca is also looking at it from a point of, if we do this, we will be able to sustain ourselves without relying on somebody, so that if Venice is not there tomorrow, we are still able to have the same good. So in a nutshell, for me, that is what Smith is trying to say. And then he also gives examples where he speaks of towns like Leeds, Sheffield, Birmingham, and another. And he speaks about these places as not initially being really global trading centers. Instead, they developed into trading centers because of the agricultural areas that they had, which became very productive enough to support what they were not farming directly. So Fiona explained about the surplus. So once agriculture produced surplus food, some people now could specialize in manufacturing instead of food production or for own consumption. So if you look at that cycle, there's an economic growth cycle that Smith is speaking to. So one, agriculture creates surplus food. Then that surplus food then supports urban populations, which Fiona spoke to in her chapter. And then those urban populations create industries. And then industries expand trade. Trade creates wealth. Wealth increases demand. And that's the increase for demand then means you have to produce more agriculturally. So that's the cycle that he speaks to. So as cities became wealthier, what is observing is farmers now had more incentive to produce more food. So they produced more food and raw materials for the urban markets, which were now found in the cities and the markets. So instead of farmers producing purely for subsistence, agriculture became more commercialized. So we are producing, so even if I have a surplus, I am going to the market with my surplus. And now, because that is now a reality and it is happening and it is being adapted, this forces the landlords to begin changing their behavior. So rather than relying on their feudal extractions where they are being very, very rigid now, and if I was to say it in Kiswahili, wananyanyasa watu, they now become more interested in the profits. And in becoming more interested in the profits, they also are now interested in the trade and the market protections within. Because now towns have more are now more open and offer opportunities for wealth and consumption. So this weakens feudalism. Steve, just allow me. So this weakens feudalism. So this is, and for me, this is the takeaway that we have to take away from this chapter. That what allowed people 250 years to break away from feudalism was commerce. That because economic systems were now built on stronger grounds, you can clearly tell that when an economic system is failing, it is not failing or collapsing because people decide they are unfair. No, it changes because new forms of economic activity create incentives, and the incentives created are actually new, and there is new power structure. So for me in this chapter, towns created that alternative source of wealth, and people no longer dependent entirely on land ownership. There was now different things that people could immerse themselves beyond land ownership that they were comfortable doing. So as I conclude, it is very evident that he is just speaking to how the rise of cities and towns transformed Europe from a stagnating feudal society into a growing commercial economy. So his argument is that towns revived trade. And as we will be going into the next session, you will agree with me that it is a reality even today. And in towns reviving trade, there was also an opportunity for encouraged specialization. And with that encouraged specialization, people were allowed to create new forms of wealth beyond land ownership. And the greatest thing is that emergence of towns and cities now widened people's minds from land ownership into what other thing can we do to generate wealth that will make our nation greater. So in a nutshell, I think, Steve, that's it for me. Thank you.
Wow. Thanks, Winnie. Thanks a lot for that. I see how the connection is there between the first chapter of the book, the second, and now the third. As we're saying, we're now into the fourth and last chapter of book 3 by Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations. Let me invite my colleague Moses, who will take us through his chapter, the one he's going through. And the title is How the Commerce of the Towns Contributed to the Improvement of the Country. I think he'll sum it up with everything that has been said. Moses, please let us know, what arguments is Adam Smith making in this chapter?
Thanks, Steve. I hope you can hear me.
Loud and clear, go ahead.
Thank you. So as we have already seen from all the way since Fiona started to Winnie, what Adam Smith is trying to do in book 3 is trying to understand what exactly led to people becoming richer or wealthier in this case. And one of the key components that keep coming up is agriculture and commerce. In Adam Smith's time, and allow me to start to kick this off by making a point that Adam Smith barely observed services as a productive thing. He mostly observed production of goods. So production of services was not necessarily prominent in that times. And probably Adam Smith would be surprised of how much services contribute to the wealth of nations today. In this chapter, which speak of how the commerce of town contributed to the improvement of the country, Adam Smith lists 3 things that towns contributed in the improvement of any nation or country. And then he goes ahead and he focuses mostly on the third reason why towns contributed to improvement of countries. And then Adam Smith, if you read the whole book, he gives a lot of example using England, which was wealthier then than his country, Scotland. And England was quite a dominant country then, and therefore most of the examples are England. So we also do a case study on England. And then also in this chapter, Adam Smith make a side note concerning land ownership and which form of ownership he thought was supreme to the other. And then he concludes on what exactly led to development of towns and what was important for commerce to take place. So why or in what way did towns contribute to the improvement of countries? And remember, we are not talking about the importance of town, but the commerce that was happening in those towns. As Winnie described, towns were just places where especially there was basic markets, and this is just platforms and also exchange of goods amongst people. And also it was the place where manufacturing started showing up. So this was the basic definition of towns. Now, commerce in this case meant the exchange of goods. Well, in today's terms, we would say exchange of goods and services for money or for whatever consideration there is. But in those times, Adam Smith just considered the exchange of goods or commodities. Now, towns offered a ready and great market for what was produced in lands. And that was one of the important things that enabled towns to have more commerce than places that were rural in this case. So how did this come up? Remember, in this age, most people relied on agriculture and mining, so basically extraction. And in towns, remember there was manufacturing in towns, and therefore it meant rude products. And it's funny that Adam Smith considered or called raw materials rude product or rude produce. Today it's called raw produce or raw materials. Demand for raw materials was high in towns. And this is because there was also part of manufacturing. Remember, raw materials or raw produce or road produce, as Adam Smith referred to it, mostly came from cultivation. And so since demand for road produce went up, it meant people were incentivized to do more cultivation. And in the end, it meant that land was put into better use, most of it which probably was uncultivated, began being cultivated in order to fulfill this demand. Now, this demand not only expanded to a country, it also went outside the country's border. And Adam Smith noted that towns encourage also international trade, what would we call it today? So remember, the manufacture which was happening in these towns required root produce. For this root produce, it was either acquired internally within the nation or outside the country. And Adam Smith notes that the emergence of towns and commerce in town led to the demand of root produce, both from within the country or outside that country. And this was more important, but he notes something important, and I think this is important, especially if you are from Africa or any developing nation, that the market was readily available, firstly, to local production. Because one thing, and this is taught in international trade, and it can be observed in international trade, the cost that comes in transporting goods from across different countries is high, and therefore it makes anything that is imported or bought from whenever, even if it's not tariffed or slapped with custom duties, it would still be a little expensive than the local produce, unless the imports are being produced at a more efficient level. And Adam Smith notes that the local producer earned more because, one, they had the advantage of distance, and therefore the market was more readily available to them than it was to outside the country. And also because they also did not have to incur huge transport costs, and it meant then they could sell their produce at a lower cost than what came from the international market. Now, it's important, and allow me to clarify this, that when a country is producing whatever goods that will be required either for direct consumption or for production of other goods within itself, the markets within its borders are first available to that production, unless somebody or farms outside the country's confine can produce better, more efficiently, therefore more cheaply than them. And in that case, then it's better off, as Adam Smith argued in other chapters of this book, that the country allows the importation of those goods rather than put up custom to prevent that from happening, and therefore forcing its people to produce these goods inefficiently. The second reason why the commerce of town contributed to the improvement of the country, it's because towns created wealth. People could manufacture, people could sell their road produce, and this exchange created wealth. Once this wealth was acquired, remember, the main articles of production here was land. It led to these people, the rich or the wealthy, going and buying the uncultivated land. One, so they increase the value of land. And number two, they put land into use. And what that led to is it developed the country by expanding how much of its resources were being put into use. And number two, by increasing the price of its resources. Now, the third one, and which Adam Smith paid a great amount of time to eat because it dominates this chapter, is that commerce of town led to order, to good governments, to liberty, and to the security of individuals. Now, if you listened to what Emmanuel pointed out, that power in society then lied to those who own lands. Now, how did commerce of town lead to order? How did it bring good governments? How did it encourage liberty? And how did it secure individuals? Now, before commerce, the rich, and the rich here were mostly those who own land. So the land barons had massive lands. And so what it means, they could produce food. And given that they could not exchange their land produce for anything, it meant the excess of what they could not consume themselves, they could only use it to maintain other people. Now, what that meant is that landowners had so much produce that some people in society had to depend on them. Now, remember, this is before commerce, and I'll explain why this was not possible when commerce showed up. Now, if somebody is feeding other people, or people are dependent on them, then it meant the power of control lied to the land barons. So the center of power was around those who had land. So they controlled society. And Adam Smith observed that there was some form of governments in those times, but since power was controlled by those who had the power to feed people, then the governments could not control the landowners. The landowners had more power. And this is probably visible in these days. You realize that countries that have very prominent people in agriculture, that these people actually, to some extent, have so much power, which they use to lobby government for certain policy or not in this case. But in this case, the land barons had the say in society. Now, the people who are fed or who are dependent on land barons, some became offered services on the lands, others became part of militia, and Adam Smith notes, and I think this is important to distinguish, that present day military or police are also dependent upon those that pay them. And therefore, the militia that existed then could be compared to the present day police and military forces. But now the problem here was there was no one center, there was no one big land baron, there were multiple. And therefore, we had different people who had different servants with the different militias of their own. And now, what this meant is that if any land baron wanted to safeguard their interest, then they had an army of themselves to use to do that. And therefore, this led to a lot of conflicts and wars. And another thing he notes is that government was not able to administer justice because power lied in the hands of those who own land, and these were a few. And therefore, there was no way somebody who did not have this power could be given justice in case something unjust happened to them, because the power did not lie with government, it lied with the landowners. And number two, if two landowners had a conflict, it was, since first of all, getting the militia was cheap, all they needed is to feed them with the bounty of their land, as Adam Smith notes, then they used war as a mechanism to safeguard their interest more than more organized way of solving their dispute. So this management of people and this arrangement, they kept people under control of the land. So Adam Smith notes that the owners of land were more powerful than the kings of those times. And therefore he notes that even the feudal law that was introduced to moderate the authority of these landowners or barons still failed. And the reason it failed is because power remained in the hands of the few. Now, after making that observation that one, landowners had their own military or militia, number two, that they dictated the laws because they had the power, number two, that it was impossible to control them unless power was diluted from them, and you couldn't dilute the power by setting laws. The real power lied in ownership of land, and they still possessed that. And another thing is that these landowners were rich enough that the initial coining of money was started by landowners. So they also were determining currency in that case. And to some extent, those who lived on their lands were levied. So their servants, their militia who depended on them for food and all that were fully dependent to them because they also levied to actually live, also get subsistence from their land. So they held both the civil and the criminal jurisdiction over these people. Now, what did commerce of town do to this power? So this case, Adam Smith did not denote it this way, but I'll denote it as the miracle of commerce. Now, when commerce came, and this is free exchange of, well, if it's today's term, I would say goods and services for consideration. And this consideration could be other goods and services, it could be money, or it could be anything. Before that, immediately that emerged, the owners of land realized that they did not have to feed anybody. They were better off exchanging their bounty, the bounty of their land, in the markets than necessarily giving it away and creating dependency and having retainers. So commerce led to the selling and buying of excesses. And once that happened, the dependency immediately shrank. What that means is that power was immediately diluted by commerce. Now, immediately that happened, so nobody was necessarily determining what is available to somebody else by themselves like before. So everybody's providence came from different sources. And given that occasion, it meant also power at the same time was diluted, and therefore there was less conflict. And that means that the barons now did not have the maximum power. Now, this created something. Given now the barons did not have an incentive to keep their own militia, to have excess servants than they needed, they only needed to employ enough people who would produce or facilitate the production of their lands. Then they noticed for justice to prevail, for them to be secure, and also for the markets to be safeguarded, they needed a form of government. And that's when power shifted and the feudal law started working, because everybody had an incentive, first of all, that there is order, and number two, that there is a good government that administers justice and take care of the commons, the provision of public goods, and also a stable environment whereby if a dispute arises, you can have justice administered to you in a better way. So immediately society was incentivized to actually to have a good government. But more importantly, the land barons also realized they need to be allowed to exchange freely. And for that to happen, then they needed a system that respected the liberty of mankind. And therefore, by commerce happening, and remember I titled this part The Miracle of Commerce, war reduced because now conflict was solved in a more organized manner. Land barons had no incentive to keep retainers and people depending on them who were not productive. Number two, the markets were needed, the exchange was needed, and security was needed, and therefore people had the incentive to have order and all that, and therefore society started improving. Now, once the influence of the rich people reduced on the lives of people significantly, war reduced. Adam Smith says something I find quite fascinating, and something when Adam Smith is quoted of saying the selfish incentive of people, people take that to mean very bad things. But necessarily here, Adam Smith just means people safeguarding their interest. But Adam Smith note, it's the selfish pursuit of profit that laid ground for the formation of governance and order. So it's by the land barons realizing that they can exchange their excess produce, which Adam Smith refers the bounty of their land, in a market that led to the improvement of how people were governed. And that was important because it also enabled people to have more freedoms. They were not levied. All they needed to do is earn income and be able to live in their own terms. They were not controlled, as they would be employed anywhere they were more productive, and therefore their liberties were more secured. And since also the landowners needed markets to operate efficiently, then they also favored a system where there was liberty and people were secured, and also private property was actually respected. And conquest was not a way of expanding lands. If you wanted to expand your land, you needed to buy it or to purchase it or to exchange it with somebody else. Now, at this point, Adam Smith makes a side note, and this he noticed of land ownership, and he realized something he called a bad practice. Adam Smith argued against land inheritance. He notes that when land was passed down from one hand to another, and this was especially done in a family, so land being passed down based on blood relations or marriage or whatever practices that existed then it ended up land falling into hands that did not improve the land to the maximum. And so some countries, and in this case, he notes, Wales and Scotland had an inheritance system where land had remained in the hands of a few. So if, for example, somebody came from a family that owned large tracts of land, then land was passed down to them. And in most cases, it was passed down to the firstborn son. In this case, son meaning male. So Adam Smith noticed and says that this kind of land system discouraged two things. It discouraged subdivision of land, it discouraged sale of land, and therefore land did not end up with people who would make it more productive. It ended up with people who were already favored by birthrights or marriage or whatever. And he says this was not the best way, and this was not the best mechanism for land to be passed down. He argues the best way was people to allow land to be subdivided. And he argues this: if somebody could own, let's say, an acre of land and they could put it into best practice, they're likely to buy that portion of land and they're likely to best utilize it. So he said that subdivision of land was good as an end by itself because it means that land fell to some particular hands that were able to put it into the best use they could. And number two, he also argued that by subdividing land, first of all, it enables many people to have it, and therefore it's more land is put in more active hands, and also the sale of land. Therefore, that if somebody noticed that they better use their time in a different way than land cultivation, they are not tied down to keep their land. They will just pass it down to somebody else. Now, Adam Smith was right in this, but I think it was incomplete, and these need to be qualified, which Adam Smith did not do. And therefore, if you notice, especially let's, for example, take Kenya into perspective, most farming in Kenya is small scale. And that has been quite a barrier, given that small scale farming has led to one, slow uptake of technology in increasing productivity of land. And number two, it has forced most land to remain at subsistence level, and therefore productivity is still conflicted or low in this case. And therefore, I think Adam Smith needed to qualify this. It's not like he was wrong, only that I think this statement needed to be that land was to be subdivided and sold to those who had the capacity to own it, whether in large tracts or smaller portions of it, and those who could utilize it in better ways. Because necessarily, small-scale farming or land ownership does not mean the land is put into the best use it could be put into. I think in that case, this work was lacking. Now, after making this side note, Adam Smith studies a case study. And remember here he compares Wales and Scotland had a land system where land was passed down using a family system. So it remained in the hands of a few, irrespective of whether it was the most productive it could be used into. So for commerce to thrive, land needed to be used in the most productive way, because land utilization used to feed the markets, which used to make commerce to thrive. And he observed that in places such as Hong Kong and Singapore, they grew necessarily out of commerce. He makes a comment based on observation of commerce, that commerce is slow and uncertain. And he argues, like he has done a lot in this book, that agriculture was a better way to grow than commerce. And the reason he argues, commerce can only happen if land production is happening. Not necessarily if the land production was to slow down, then commerce could not be depended upon. Is that true? Well, in today's world, and given that, remember, Adam Smith criticizes Hong Kong's and Singapore approach to depending entirely on commerce and not necessarily, he doesn't criticize them. He criticizes some towns for depending on commerce entirely and not on agriculture and cultivation. But I think Adam Smith today would be surprised on the magnificence of Singapore and Hong Kong, which has most of its growth and wealth is around commerce. Now, as I almost near the conclusion, like I said, Adam Smith liked or respected wealthy nations, and England would happen to be one of them. So in the case of this, Adam Smith observed why England had a thriving commerce. And he mentions three characteristics of England that made it a seat of commerce and manufacture. Number one, he noticed agriculture had England had such natural fertile lands, which meant that their lands would produce more than probably comparative to other lands. Number two, England had an access to a seacoast. And what this means is that the excess of its production could be transported to other places and sold under international trade, in this case. And that, if that was not necessarily a good endowment for England, they also had inland rivers. And more importantly, these rivers were navigable. So it meant if production happened, let's say in the inland, it could still get to towns because the rivers were a good mechanism for transport. Well, this is way before when the sophisticated air transport, rail transport, and also road transport had come into effect. And therefore, navigable rivers were such an important aspect of transport in this case. He also noticed that they did not only drive in that, they drove because of the policy they enacted. But Adam Smith makes something that will be discussed later in the political systems. I think this will be in book 5 or book 6. He noticed that England protected its farmers, and it protected them by ensuring there was import control. So things that England was heavily producing, like corn and cattle, were heavily controlled. You could barely export those to England. And that offered price monopoly to the farmers in England. Adam Smith notes that this goodwill of their government created a favorable environment for the farmers in this country and encouraged them to keep their cultivation. But he notes this was more illusionary than it was real. So he says, whereas these laws pretend to have protected the farmers, it was more of an illusion. It did not make England great, but it ensured that the farmers kept their cultivation moving. And I think Adam Smith in later chapters is going to debunk the whole aspect of protectionism. And one of my colleagues will probably bring that up. So England farmers were allowed to be independent, they were allowed to be secure, and they were respected in the England community, and that made England thrive, not only in cultivation, but also in commerce. Now, as I wrap this up, Adam Smith notes that commerce of town, it led to creation of markets for both local production and also for production abroad. It also led to wealthy people buying land which was uncultivated or less utilized, and therefore once it was bought by people who had more resources, they were able to utilize it in a better way, and therefore the wealth of that nation accumulated. But more importantly, he notes that commerce led to order, it leads to demand for a good government, it leads to securing the liberty of individuals, as he has pointed out that commerce diluted the power of the land barons and allowing other people to thrive by just offering their services and also production and reducing the amount of dependency on one person. So in conclusion, Adam Smith notes that for any commerce to thrive, there was a need that there be as little war as possible. Now, if you observe today, as the US and Israel rain terror on Iran, and Iran decide to obstruct trade through closing the Strait of Hormuz, as they do once in a while, as Adam Smith observed then, it's true today that war discourages commerce, and once commerce is discouraged, the wealth of the nation and its growth is curtailed. And once that happens, people tend to be more poorer. And therefore, as I conclude, as Adam Smith notes, that commerce of town is important for the growth of town. And that's why I think previously, as we did in the last book, Adam Smith notes, it's not how big the lands you own are or how much endowed they are. It's the utilization and putting them into use that determine whether a nation was wealthy or not. And that's the end of this. Thank you.
Wow. Wow. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Moses. Okay, with that, we come to the first part of our analysis of Adam Smith's book, book 3, to be precise. And just to bring us back to this stage is that the first part of this analysis, just to let us know what each of my colleagues thought, the arguments that were brought about in each of the chapters that we've gone through, 1 through 4. And I think, to be honest, I think they've done justice to all the 4 chapters, so I won't belabor much on that. But then we have a second part, and now we go into the practicality of this particular arguments that Adam Smith was placing. And I want to begin with my colleague Fiona, and I will go in the same order again. So Fiona, please, as you come on, I want you to try and look at the chapter you looked at and see and let us know. Do you think that these arguments made by Adam Smith in the chapter you are analyzing are relevant in the contemporary world, in the current context? So please let us know what your thoughts are. Go ahead.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Steve. Yes, they are. And then, of course, there are certain elements in which they don't agree. So because we were 3 discussants, I think I'll give 3 points, one for Winnie, one for Moses, and another one for Emmanuel. So the first one is, what stands out for me, and this is Winnie's, is the fact that, you look at Kenya, even as a country, and Adam Smith, one of the things that he argued, and that was his first point, was that, towns generally draw mainly from the surrounding countryside. But then you look at what Kenya consumes through the international supply chains. So think petroleum, think machinery, pharmaceuticals, vehicles, even electronics. And at the same time, you look at our exports, which mostly leave this country either raw or they're lightly processed, yeah? So like maybe our flowers or our horticulture or coffee. So in many ways, we find that we actually export raw value and import finished value. So that complicates Smith's picture to some extent, because for him, it was mostly like the nearby countryside is what is feeding the town, and then the town simply sends back manufactured goods. So unless in the entire global landscape, for us, we are the countryside, and then these other nations that we do trade with are what maybe would be considered towns, because we don't see a lot of that give to the towns and then give back to the countryside. And then I'll go into Moses, because he gave an example which I was preparing to give, and that is on Singapore. Because again, you see the sequence that Smith gives us is agriculture, then manufacturing, then foreign commerce third. And of course, it's a very powerful framework, but we can see that the modern world does not always move like that. And so Moses already gave us the example of Singapore, which they didn't become wealthy because of agricultural surplus, but you can see mostly just because of all of these services. And the third point, which then would be to Emmanuel, for Emmanuel, is that I can see a lot of the role that institutions play and how important that is. So, Smith was arguing that if we leave people to make their own decision, they'll then move from land and then manufacturing and then trade. But today, I get the sense that, you know, development is rarely just about this natural inclination, because government and its role, they play a very deliberate role. So for instance, even if you think about some of the Kenyan policies, so, you know, industrial parks or roads or tax incentives, then all of these are some of the reasons why then people would move their capital to a particular area as opposed to another. And I don't know if Winnie had touched on it a bit when she was talking about kings and how the kings would support certain towns and all of that. But you can see that play between institutions, the role that the institutions, and by institutions would be government institutions, and how they play, and how all of these factors do actually end up shaping how people make decisions, as opposed to, you know, just surpluses, which was one of the main reasons that he gave for opulence. Yeah. And Steve, I must apologize that I will not give 4 points, one for you. So I've given one for Winnie, Moses, and Imani. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Fiona. That was nice. That was wonderful. Yes, and so as we look at how these arguments can be applied in the current world, or in the context we're living in now, Fiona has actually given us a bit of that, and she's actually jumped into each of these chapters. But nonetheless, I want to welcome Emmanuel. Emmanuel, if you could kindly let us know your thoughts on how the arguments that Adam Smith is proffering are applicable in the current context. Emmanuel?
Yeah, thanks. So I think that Adam Smith's arguments are important to consider because they give us principles by which all these the wealth of nations, by which nations become wealthy. So, for example, even though Singapore and Hong Kong became wealthy because of commerce, that commerce could not have happened if the rest of the world, especially China and the United States and Europe and to some extent the Gulf, were not wealthy. Because otherwise, and then in the same way, we observe the same thing in say the Italian city states, that they themselves were also major. Some of them, like Venice, were major centers of merchant trade, but it was also made possible because other parts of the world were becoming wealthy or had the types of products that were attractive, you know, whether it's spices from the East and such. And I think Adam Smith is also important because he shows us uh, how rules can change, and you think that everything necessarily continued to get better after a Roman Empire, for example, or any given time period. But then once you get into the details, you might find that some rules changed, and some fundamental change in rules drove people back to a poverty that maybe they didn't know before, and then another positive evolution in rules again can offer people a way out of poverty. So it's important up to this day.
Okay, thanks a lot, Emmanuel. I see the drift as we move along on how these principles and what Adam Smith was advocating for, or rather arguments are applicable in the current scenario. And the examples that both of you, Emmanuel and Fiona, have given are very important. I think even in Kenya sometimes the head of state says we are going to Singapore, and maybe perhaps you might have wanted to look at what Adam Smith was doing and apply those particular principles here. But again, you also say that it's not applicable now because things have changed. Commerce has been overtaken, looking at the model that Adam Smith argued for. But going forward, I would like to request Winnie to be on standby. Winnie, kindly let me know, let us know. What do you think, do you, in your own way, see these arguments made by Adam Smith being applicable in the current context?
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, just like the others, before me, Fiona and Emmanuel, I still think his arguments on the growth of towns and cities and what the impact there was, I think it's still very relevant because if you look at today's world, we have what we are currently calling urbanization. And urbanization is largely people moving from rural areas into the urban areas. And the urban areas are largely the cities and towns that Smith is talking about then. So if we were to look at Nairobi, for example, Nairobi is it's considered an economic hub for East Africa. Why? Because of how, in terms of how the opportunities available within Nairobi, and the opportunities that are available within Nairobi are not really limited to Nairobi. They actually help support even other countries, Uganda, Tanzania. So anytime an investor is thinking of setting up, for example, the first place I want to believe they think about is Nairobi. And because of a few things, a port, infrastructure, and other things that are available within Nairobi. So I agree with him that his arguments, and I believe his arguments still hold. If you also look at in terms of why people are moving because of the new opportunities that were offered within the emerging towns and cities. And beyond the emerging town, the opportunities, there are also those benefits they are getting for moving into the towns and cities. And the same applies to us currently. Those who move into towns and cities move because opportunities are more concentrated within towns and cities. If I were to use an example of a business investor, for example, if a business investor wanted to invest, they would move into towns and cities first. Why? Because they're looking at security, they're looking at what institutions are there within those towns and cities, the level of access to markets that they will have. So I on that end, I believe it's still relevant. And then when he speaks about specialization, you see, currently economies are growing through specialization, trade, and capital accumulation, which Smith has spoken about continuously in his observations. And then he also gives arguments around incentives. And I mean, incentives are incredibly modern. We hear people always speaking about incentives. And economies really, really struggle when people are faced with uncertainty. And if you have uncertainty, you have insecurity issues, you have corruption, you have all those things going on. If you read the African Financial Markets Index, the index largely looks at countries and economic performance and weights them, and of that weighting, they are rated. And so if you look at that and the things that foreign investors look at, it is largely around uncertainty, and the uncertainty is normally around taxes. Is your tax regime predictable? Is it not predictable? How is it? And then the insecurity, of course. Emmanuel or Moses actually gave the example of what's going on with the US-Israel war right now. So you can imagine those are things Smith spoke about 250 years ago, and we are now experiencing them live and direct. So businesses will only invest when they trust a system enough to believe that they will benefit from their effort. And that can only be seen in the urban areas largely. So if Fiona has touched on this, I will not really dwell much on it. If you look at his discussions on trade, that is also very relevant because you see many developing countries still facing challenges that Smith described. And those challenges are things such as exporting raw materials while importing high value manufactured goods. You see, those are things that are happening currently. But 250 years ago, a guy called Smith was already speaking about them. And if you look at the long-term goal for any country is always in terms of exports and imports. Their long-term goal is always to move from raw production towards on manufacturing, value addition, and increasing their economic activity. So I think, Steve, if you asked me, it is very, very relevant. The dynamics might have changed because what was happening then is not happening currently. But if you were to relate just the concepts, the arguments, and the observations, and then tweak them to fit into our current economic reality, then you observe that, yeah, a lot is happening. Dynamics have changed, globalization, technology, all those things have been introduced, but the concepts still remain. So if Smith was to write for us today, Steve, I think we'd still be on the same page. Thank you.
Wow. Interesting. Well done, well articulated. I won't belabor any or add anything to that. I think that was straightforward. But then I'll also pose the same question to my colleague Moses. Moses, having looked at commerce and town and how commerce contributed to the improvement of the country, looking at commerce and the towns, do you see these concepts or rather arguments being posed by Adam Smith being relevant in the current scenario?
Well, Steve, allow me to start by first conceding that the ideas and the knowledge written, especially in book 3 by Adam Smith, is all true correct. Some of it might be missing in terms of it has gaps or it is incomplete, but Adam Smith's observation and writing are very precise and also to the point. As Emmanuel clearly pointed out, and I need to qualify my statement about Singapore and Hong Kong, there's no Singapore and Hong Kong if whatever they are exchanging is not produced elsewhere. And therefore, to that extent, Adam Smith was correct that commerce was dependent on what was to be exchanged. The part I disagree with Adam Smith is, Adam Smith says that the faster way to a nation becoming wealthier was through agriculture and not commerce, because he claims commerce is slow and it's unpredictable. Now, you can understand one thing, that Adam Smith, he appears to have been very well traveled because he quotes China, he quotes the British colonies in the US and all that, but he might have not observed that some countries were actually not endowed enough to have lands for agriculture. He might have missed that point. And therefore, if that argument still hold, it could mean then countries that could not exercise the agriculture were condemned not to grow by them just depending on commerce. And his argument that growth-based growth, and by growth here, remember Adam Smith focus is all just wealth of nation, that the growth in the wealth of any nation would be slower if it depended on commerce and did not implement necessarily agriculture is wrong, because countries that have gone commerce through and through and have neglected agriculture because they don't have the endowment to actually go that way have also grown way faster than some countries whose major focus is agriculture. And I think in that right, then it's possible to grow faster even with commerce alone. It's true that Adam Smith observed that commerce was not to be depended upon. And this argument stems from Adam Smith lived in times where war would emerge anytime. And therefore, if war emerged and people who were producing decided not to transport their goods to be exchanged in towns that depended on commerce, then it means, and allow me to give a simple example, if the people in Nairobi who trade in making fries or selling potatoes, and then there's war that cuts Nairobi off from those who produce potatoes, like my village, Molo, then it means the people dependent on that commerce would definitely find it very difficult to survive. And therefore, it's true that commerce is riskier in that way. A country dependent on commerce alone needs very stable, good governance. And now, then countries needed to worry about their own peace and stability. Now countries have to worry about the stability of the world. And this is especially important for Kenya, given that Kenya is a small open economy. And what that means, Kenya is not able to produce enough to make its commerce vibrant enough for everybody to thrive. It also need to depend on the world. And in that said, then it means if the peace of the world is threatened, Kenya is threatened indirectly or directly. And therefore, yeah, it's true, commerce has that risky aspect of it. And that's why it calls for world peace, world order, and also people protecting rule-based system. And I think for me, reading these and given the fact that Adam Smith was not as fortunate as probably I am, and those of us seated here to attend an economic class, and him making those observations and those comments, I think that was brilliant work. Thanks.
Yeah, whereas we read and also understand, we also have to try and poke holes where they exist. So thanks a lot, Moses, for doing that. Of course, it's not a straight line that whatever Adam Smith was said has to work as it is. But the principles, as you said correctly, are actually applicable. And I agree with you in total, as I agree with the rest of my colleagues. As we come to a close of this particular session, guys, I want us to probably do our concluding remarks. And again, I'll start with you, Fiona, just to perhaps, as you are going through this, you are reading of the first chapter of book 3. Any particular concluding remarks you want to share with the rest of our listeners? Kindly.
But maybe I could just add something that's not very, it's not very not obvious, is the fact that, Adam Smith has taught us a lot about even just observing how different systems work, and to understand cliche how nations work. And so for me, that is something that I will always love about this particular book, especially now because this is the third time that I am coming on here as a discussant. Yeah.
So I think Adam Smith remains important, and it's good to remember as one reads this book that it's about how households and firms become wealthy. In the present day and in an age of global competition and geopolitics, we tend again to talk about nations competing against nations, which just does happen. But what is easily lost is that there are people living within these nations, and that we should take the lessons of the past and apply them in the present. And in this case, the lessons about the wealth of nations, placing a primacy as much as we can on the individuals, not forgetting them, even as we try to negotiate new positions at the global level. And that ultimately, if we should choose a direction to go, we should base our friendships among nations primarily on those nations that espouse freedom for the individual, and have those as the foundation of our foreign relations. Thanks.
Moses said something, I call him Musa. So he said something very interesting about he thinks Adam Smith must have been really well traveled, and that hit me because, he gives examples of what today we are calling developed countries, and those developed countries are countries that we think are wealthier, right? So he gives examples of some of the wealthiest nations as he is writing, and for me it takes me to the point of, even as we think of these cities and towns and just their growth and how things have happened, it would be interesting for us to just pick, in terms of the development records, where they started to where they are right now, what they did right and what they did wrong, for them to get to the point of developed countries. Because, I mean, Adam Smith's book, The Wealth of the Nations, is just a journey of wealthy nations to where they are today, if in my view, what their journey has been, what they did right, where they started, most importantly. And so for me, I think for a book that was written 250 years ago, sitting at the Institute of Economic Affairs in today and relating it and finding that despite the different dynamics that have changed in terms of technology and all these other things my colleagues have mentioned, that we can still find some relevance in it, is something worth sitting back and asking ourselves, what more? What did Adam see then that we should be looking forward to today? What is this thing that, because Moses enlightened me the other day that he's just this guy who's, I think his bedroom, Moses, was facing the market. And off that, he just sat, and this book is off those observations and much more observations that he was making facing the market as traders interacted. And he just made observations and came up with these arguments. So 250 years ago and still relevant today. I think that's something, Steve, and we should actually, beyond what the IEA is giving, people should actually take a bit more time to go through this book and just internalize, because my interpretation of his arguments might not actually be your interpretation of his arguments. So it would be interesting for somebody to read and push back and tell Winnie, excuse me, ma'am, I have a different view about that argument that he was making. So please take time, read the book, and let's engage. Thank you, Steve.
Well, I don't think Adam Smith educates them. But either way, one of the things, first of all, just on a lighter note, that the English Adam Smith use sometimes proves so difficult to me. But either way, beyond that, the ideas are quite relevant. And one of the things I would like to emphasize as I make this conclusion is Adam Smith's observation that good governments did not come as by themselves.
Yeah.
They were actually society incentivized good government because they realized for them to safeguard their interest, a good government was a good thing. Now, the good thing about that observation is, and this will be my conclusion, by Adam Smith observing the right order of how things happened, he was able to answer the right questions. So, for example, one would assume the fact that something existed means that was the first thing that came up. But by Adam Smith going step by step, it allowed him to be able to tell where the world of nation. Adam Smith knows that a good government is required for commerce to thrive, but it's commerce that came first before a good government. And by being able to see that order, it also means Adam Smith was able to ask the right question and try and get the right answer. Why is this important to us? We live in a poor country. Well, I am a Christian, and I think Adam Smith had exposure to Christianity because he actually gives some Christian example in his book. In my next chapter, there will be a bit of that. And well, saying we are a poor country might sound to those who like manifesting as a bad thing, but either way, I'm not manifesting, I'm describing. So we come from a poor country, And we also need to sit at the place Adam Smith sat, because Adam Smith was from a poorer country. He was from Scotland. And he was exposed because he used to visit London a lot because he liked debating with lawmakers in London. And he noticed that England is way wealthier than we are. And he goes and explore what makes a nation wealthier. He asks the right question. He checks the order of how things happened, and he checks what was the individual contribution of people and what do people need to be able to contribute, which Winnie stated here, people need freedom to be able to solve their problem. But by him asking the right question, he offers the right answers. Now, in a country as poor as ours, it's easier to observe the poverty, the pains. But if the questions are not asked right, the suggested solution will always go wrong for us. And I think that's an important lesson that we all need to learn here, because, again, some of the laws that have been implemented or have been suggested in this country are diagnosing the wrong problems and therefore solving the wrong problems, some which exist and some that don't, and therefore they end up creating more problems for us. Maybe we need an Adam Smith moment as a country. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Moses. I think I'll end it at that. Maybe we need another Adam Smith moment in this country. Yes, I couldn't agree more. So with that, guys, we come to the end of today's recording. We have still 2 more chapters to go. We have 2 more books, rather. Book 5, which is titled Of Systems of Political Economy, with 9 chapters. That will be tackled next week, or we'll just post it on our social pages. And book 5, which is of the revenue of the sovereign Commonwealth. So please be on the lookout for these particular chapters that will be covered by my colleagues, not necessarily the ones that are here today, but at the IEA fraternity as a whole. We thank you for being with us. Look out for those. And IEA is a membership organization. Please log in to our website, www.ieakenya.or.ke. Click on our membership tab. You'll be directed accordingly and be assisted to join in as a member with very, very, very many benefits. And so with that, I thank you a lot and look forward to the next session.